Hi, everybody. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about race and ethnicity and how your own race and ethnicity shape how you walk through the world, and how society views you, and or how um, what privilege or discrimination or what have you might have depending on these things. So at the start of this, I want to say I'm going to acknowledge first and foremost that I am looking at this through a very that I can only see. That's not true. That I, as a person, and my positionality as a white person allows me to have the ability to turn on and off some of these issues as um, as I want to interact with them. Whereas for a lot of people of color, that option is not there. So I acknowledge that there's a level of privilege in me being able to speak about some of these things in the sense that I don't have to experience them or live through them. And that is an important thing to acknowledge our own positionality and our own inherent differences as we walk through this chapter. On another note, as we start the chapter, I also want to acknowledge that we live on and I operate in and on land that was indigenous lands and was taken in ways that were both colonialistic and genocidal, and these things have never been corrected or atoned for in a way that is appropriate and or helpful. So I want to make sure that I'm acknowledging both the positionality I hold and the geographic location and its ancestry as we move into this incredibly important chapter. All right, so let's get started. So race is a socially constructed category rooted in the belief that there are fundamental differences among human associated with phenotype and ancestry. So essentially, and race has about a bajillion different definitions depending on where you are, because we also construct the concept of race differently depending on the geographic location. So in some places in the world, race also has to do with the religious ideology of your ancestry. It has to do with the not just the color of your skin, but also different kinds of traits such as the geographic location you were born, things of that nature. So you have different kinds of racial and ethnic hierarchies that play out in very different ways globally. Here in the United States, we've used race through very coloristic lenses. We view race as very much white to dark. And we view race in very broad categories such as African American or Black, and such as brown, and that can include Hispanic, such as Asian, that can include a wide variety of different ethnic backgrounds that may or may not exist or contradict each other. And we do the same when we use the word Latino or Latinx, because we're talking about a wide variety of possibilities that could be happening within that. And hold on just one second. Hey, kiddos. But so when we talk about any of these categories within American culture, we're going to look at things differently than, say, maybe class or race is constructed in India, or race is constructed in even Europe to an extent, right? Very much so, Jewish individuals were not considered white for a very long time in Europe, and in some cases are considered their own racial category still today in different parts of that. However, that particular here, most Jewish people would fall under a religious category and then also a category of race, depending on the color of their skin. And the color of their parents' skin. So this is something that's super important as we move forward to understand that we construct this, right? This is changed through time, space. It varies depending on where you are on the globe. And because of that, we understand that to be socially constructed, if that makes sense. The theory of racial formation is just the process by which we essentially group or categorize people into different racial categories and then rank them into a hierarchical structure. These things get created in order to provide some kind of social control mechanism, either whether it be at an institutional level, whether it be at a governmental level, whether it be at a capitalism like economic level, whether it be at trying to provide social divisions in order to create groups that would have to be vying for the same resources, whatever the reason for these categories, they form into these in order to provide some kind of systemic level or institutional level wide difference, whether that is actual or something just made by society. Now, I say that I'm not saying that the feelings, the lived experiences aren't inherently different based on these socially constructed categories. What I'm saying is that these socially constructed categories actually do not denote real personal difference between one human to another, but their lived experiences then end up very, very different due to the fact that these social categories have very different lived experiences based on where you fall in this racial or ethnic hierarchy. Geez, I don't even not know why that word is not coming out today. Ethnicity is really just the cultural values and norms that distinguish the members of a group from one to another. So a good example of ethnicity versus race. Okay, so we categorize race as this idea of like if you were going to talk about the Latinx community in the United States, a lot of times you're going to see some kind of geographic region based thing when it comes to race. So you might look at something that's inherent to Mexico, inherent to Puerto Rico, inherent to Brazil. Like all of these things may be categorized as racial categories, or nationality categories, but then there's almost always going to be that ethnicity question, which is, are you Latinx? Are you someone that is essentially what we would consider Latinx for the most part is someone that is Spanish speaking and from North or South America in origin and or family's origin, and has some kind of cultural normative, usually language is the one they fixate on, and or cultural norms that associate you with this particular brand. Now, there's a lot of times where this particular category of Latinx is also viewed in a racial category. But the difference here comes down to cultural variation. And really, when we talk about it, we're usually talking in the US about language, about multi-generational families, about immigration. We're talking immigration status. We're also talking about particular religious ideologies are tied into that sometimes. But these things are really more about a culture as opposed to a race. Now, again, these things have very interlocking and entwined things. So if you were going to look at a Venn diagram, right, you're going to have race and ethnicity. There's going to be some crossover that's inherent because we view things in this hierarchical strategy or categories, and these categories fall into there in ways that make sense. So if you're looking at colorism, you're looking at this white to black scale that we tend to operate in the US. These very, even if they're speaking Spanish and have very Catholic views and have a particular nationality that they lean towards coming from, what have you, these things are also going to categorize them based on the color of their skin. So if they have darker skin, they're still going to have this racial phenotype based discrimination happening to them even before they speak Spanish, even before that they would have any kind of cultural variation different to white European American. And so we're going to get into that. The same category, in the same token, Black or African American individuals, depending on what they would identify themselves as, are going to look at the world from a very cultured lens that might be very different. Their communities are going to have their own inherent cultural makeup, but we look at those as almost particularly and exclusively racial. And we do that in the United States because for a long time, those communities and those differences based on cultural ideology were not recognized and still to an extent aren't. And that, so again, when I talk about this Venn diagram and how they overlap, this racial and ethnic differential gets really fuzzy. And the majority of the reason why people get lumped up in one racial category as opposed to a ethnic category is because if we did it by ethnicity, we would be having an extensive amount of categories, whereas racial, people can lump people into based on the color of their skin and based on very, very, very wide range of ideas and understandings of the world, if that makes sense. Also, we have done multiple both medical and historic and social studies that have concluded that there is at this point more differentials and more variation within a any racial category than there is as a whole. So there's going to be more differences within the like based on phenotype within the idea of what is a Black person than there is between the differences between white and Black people, because once you add all those categories are going to overlap because there's so many different phenotypic structures and individualistic face shapes that we end up having more variation, but like within racial categories than we do across human categories as a whole, if that makes sense. And so that's very interesting, and it's something to just shows how very how we are using very incorrect and socially obscure differences to create very, very tangible discriminatory practices and lived experiences. All right, so a minority group is just a group of people in society that essentially are not fitting whatever the dominant group is in the society. So, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with numbers. So you can be a minority group and have more. So say you're in the state of Florida or Texas. More than likely, the minority group based on numbers is white individuals. However, the minority group in those states is still people of color, specifically your Latinx communities, your Black communities, your any other kind of racial demographic that could be pulled apart from that. And the reason for that is because it's not necessarily about numbers, it's about the way in which society is ranking you, the way in which you receive social status, if that makes sense, or have access to those resources. Again, back to those resources distribution, those social capital, all of those things that we talked about when it came to gender, when it came to opportunities based on class. All of those things are going to be similar here. And your dominant group is, again, that one that possesses the most wealth, power, and prestige in a society. So this is going to be those people that have those resources, or a lot of those resources, have access to opportunities to obtain those resources, things of that nature. And the concept of a minority group is really based about disadvantage rather than a numerical distinction, which we just talked about. All right. Between 2000 and 2010, the proportion of Americans who identify as multiracial has increased by nearly a third. And really that just comes down to the fact that the more generations we get out of those Loving versus Virginia decisions, and those decisions that made interracial marriage legal, and the more socially accepted that becomes, the more likely there is to have those who end up with ancestries with multiple of those distinctions. Now, here's the thing. Almost everyone in their history has some kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic background, because as we move forward all the way back into human evolutionary processes, those migration patterns equaled a distinct amount of the human species interacting with other variations of the human species. And these variations weren't enough to create any kind of new species, because again, they were able to reproduce, they were able to successfully intermingle in all of these different ways. And because of that, these categories are specifically just based on societal assumptions, as opposed to based on any kind of biological distinct difference that causes a new species or a new we have a lot of human variation in the world, and those variations are going to continue to intermingle, and they're going to continue to create new variations, because as we redefine what is socially acceptable and what people can interact with, what people we create and new unique phenotype features, unique I don't know, kind of phenotypic qualities, if that makes sense. About 1 in 6 new marriages are between spouses of different race, and that's of 2015. I would be interested to see how the politics in America of the last 6 years or so would reshape that or look, and I would love to see that data based on a geographic region, because I think that there are differences happening based on political and racial rhetoric that is happening currently in the United States. So and this is an important fact, this last one. So just because there are multiracial or multi-ethnic individuals happening in the United States that might personally identify that, their lived experiences are going to be based on this monolithic idea of what society deems them as. So their interactions with the world are going to be based on what the world's perception is of their race, as opposed to what they may identify in these multiracial categories, if that makes sense. All right. Prejudice is the holding of preconceived notions about any group or individual based on and they generally are pretty resistant to change based on, and these things can be based on a lot of things. It can be based on something that is learned, well, it's almost always learned, but something that is taught, something that is taught specifically by an institution, by one of our media sources, by our leaders, based on any given group. We don't just have prejudice that are negative, we also have them that are positive. So for example, and this is something that we'll get into, there is this underarching stereotype that happens in the United States that pegs any kind of Asian American or anyone of particularly Chinese, Japanese individuals as being inherently smart, inherently hardworking, inherently academically focused. And that particular prejudice has led to this model minority kind of idea that these particular individuals are more helpful, more beneficial to society. And so they have achieved some level of whiteness or some level um, of privilege into um, a particular, I guess, class of the dominant group without having to necessarily have some of the phenotypes or even with those things. And those things, while have brought on positive things, also homogenize entire groups of people into particularly one lens or one idea structure. One widespread form of prejudice is racism. So that's going to be one of your negatives. Racism is just the idea that people should be treated differently based on the color of their skin, or based on the racial category in which they get presented or get presented with in society or operate within. And racism doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be a one-on-one interaction. It can be at an institutional level. It can be written into laws. It can be written into society structure. It can be microaggressions. It can be speech patterns. It can be just invisibility. It can be in core materials. It can be invisibility in media. It can be the way media shapes the presentation of these. It can be subvert in the sense that there's just this understanding that people have been taught that certain people have this particular stereotype that is negative, and so or the ideas, something as simple as the idea of, oh well, you don't actually represent, you're high, you're an exception. Like, well, most people from this particular racial category, I believe, is this way, but I have this one friend that's like this, or what have you. If there's this qualifying statement, generally there's a racist notion that's behind it. And so again, not all racism is intentional. Some is very unintentional and very ingrained in. However, without being unchecked, it still can lead to a significant amount of harms, a significant amount of microaggressions, a significant amount of disruption into the lives of those who experience it. Again, this is just kind of explaining the definition of racism. We've kind of gone over all of this. Racism didn't really come to be part of the understanding of the human world. It was more xenophobic in before racial categories really started to become a thing during colonial processes, when there needed to be a distinct difference between us and them, that and basing on phenotype was the easiest possible category at that point. These things allowed people to be sold and auctioned as slaves. It allowed people to be killed, murdered, maimed in the name of conquest. It allowed ideas of what's the word I'm looking for? It allowed ideas that made genocide possible. If you subject someone else or a whole group of someone else's to the idea that their value is little, or they are less than, or they are an object, or they are what have you, it is much easier to destroy said individuals. And racism and this categorization was really used as a way to diminish or diminish the human element of wartime and or conquest time colonialistic um destruction of culture and human beings. Stereotyping is one of the ways in which prejudice operates in the United or in everywhere. Stereotyping is just this idea that someone is something based on another something. So, um, uh, redheads are inherently um, mean or hot-headed because of their genetically predisposition to being angry and cranky. I don't know. None of these things are generally factual. They may be able to point to examples, but that does not homogenize an entire group of people to that particular function. And these things are usually something that changes or gets molded over time and shifted, and not all stereotypes stay, not all, but usually they feed into newer stereotypes or ideas. Although stereotypes are inaccurate representations of people, they do carry weight and they do uh, have impact um, on how the world works and how society operates. For example, and talks in one of these slide points, it talks about the most harmful ones are associated with anxiety or fear. So if you label an entire demographic of people as criminal, entire demographic of people as inherently violent or dangerous, then there is a massive amount of anxiety and fear that gets built up in those who are not that group and those who are in that group, but for different reasons. So you either are going to be fear that you're going to be looked upon in that way, and violence might be done to you, or fear that violence is going to be done to you because you're around people that you feel are, or that you have predispositioned yourself to think are violent. This happens inherently with many of the men of color within our society. We have long created systems that operate under the assumption that criminality and or religious extremism or what have you is based on racial stereotyping. And these stereotypings have really, really, really long consequences, including police attitudes and institutional justice system assumptions that create different arrest percentages, create different policing activities, create different harms within these two structures, which also creates more arrests, which also creates more economic inequality, and it goes down the line. And I think we'll get into that more in a chapter further on in this class. But again, these initial stereotypes that are wholeheartedly inaccurate at registering an entire demographic of people as one homogeneous notion. In this example, violent has created measures to essentially take down that violence within these groups, even if it is not there or represented in particular moments. So there's that. So stereotyping is linked to displacement, which is the transferring of ideas or emotions from their true source to another subject. And that's just really, we as a society like to be able to put things in neat boxes and not have things that don't make sense or aren't true all the time or have nuance, because nuance means that we have to stop and critically think about a lot of different situations all at the same time, and our brain really likes to put things in boxes so that we can check things off the list and move on as we're walking down the street. And that's not always possible. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Um, and so when we displace emotions we might feel about one particular setting onto an entire group of people, it makes it much easier for us to check boxes, whether those are correct or not. And what we end up with is essentially scapegoats, or these individuals that get blamed for the wrongs of society, or wrongs, um, uh, or specific wrongs that they're not doing, that have nothing to do with the people as a whole, that has more to do with these individualistic notions. Scapegoating is normally directed amongst groups that are relatively powerless and or who have historically been powerless. Discrimination is behavior that denies members of a particular group resources or rewards that can be obtained by others. And so really this comes back to what we were talking about when we talked about class. It's not just about money or particular like tangible resources, but it's also about social resources, including maybe letters of reference when you're trying to get into a particular kind of school, financial aid when you're trying to get into a any kind of, whether it be small business opportunity loans, whether it be housing loans, or whether it can be economic, it can be just straight up like, I know this person and I'm going to refer them for this job. Or I'm going to give you the information about this job because I think you'd be a really good fit. If you don't have that social ability to intertwine or intermingle with these particular situations, then you can't obtain that opportunity, can't obtain the resources associated with that opportunity. Right. So again, it also talks about discrimination is distinguished from prejudice in the sense that prejudice are notions and ideas. Discrimination are actual tangible acts. And so you can have you can act discriminatory towards a group, even though you are not actively prejudiced against that group. Those things can be ingrained. You can be part of the system you're operating in. It can be part of the hiring practices that you were trained to do. It can be part of the laws that you are upholding, or policies that you're upholding, what have you, what have you, what have you, what have you. On the flip side, most prejudices or biases we have in this society are learned through a multitude of different institutions, including media, including all of these things, which no one is above or completely alienated from. So the idea that you could have no prejudices that operate in society as an individual yourself is just inaccurate. Even when it comes to prejudices that affect you as a human. So as a woman, as a disabled woman, as a disabled queer woman, there are a lot of marginalized identities that I also carry, but that doesn't mean that I don't have sexist notions that I've been taught that are in the back of my head that I have to like actively check in order to not like say, hey guys, let's get started, and say, hey everyone, let's get started instead. Or that I'm not like instinctively giving certain parts of language, certain parts of interactions with other people, certain parts of policies and practices that I automatically do because I don't think about them, because I don't have to live with the consequences per se as me as a human. So if I'm not living with the consequences, maybe I'm not critically examining why that's operating in that way, because we don't have the brain power to necessarily do that with every instance. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to try to check those instances regularly enough that we reshape kind of maybe some of those ideas, if that makes sense. You're still responsible for the notions that you carry and how those impact others. Unfortunately, we have not changed the learning tactics, the policies, the procedures, all of those things to say take out the prejudices against any one particular group in our society currently. Ethnocentrism and group closure. So ethnocentrism can combine the stereotypic thought of to produce discrimination and violence. Ethnocentrism is really just this idea that there's a particular ethno group, usually white European American within this country, that is centered around, and everyone that is not, we center our history, we center our media, we center our literature, we center our education, we center our whatever, all of our society is centered around this particular group. And this particular group, when you don't fit in that particular group, then what it does is produce violence, discrimination, and inherently boundaries and borders around this particular group to try to keep that that centeredness, that expectation that they're the cultural normative, if that makes sense, for any particular area. And again, that's going to change depending on the community or subculture or what have you that you're looking at, what that center is. But when it comes to the ethnocentric understanding of the US, we're really going to be talking about white, culturally European descended Americans. All right. Group closure is just the strategies that include limits on things like intermarriage between groups, restrictions on social contact or economic relations like trading, physical separations when it comes to housing or neighborhoods or schools or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are just the strategies in which maintaining that centric notion, maintaining that social normative is kept. Again, resource allocation is key. Anytime we're talking about social statuses, because wealth, privilege, and power is really how one of the main reasons that centric notion can stay the center, and without allowing others to take part in that wealth, power, and have social status, those things don't get broken. Those prejudices, the discriminations, the practices, all of those things don't get taken away unless that wealth, power, social status, resources, opportunities, all of those things are shared. Immigration is the movement of people from one country to another for the purpose of settlement. And then the movement of people out of one country to settle in another is immigration. And so those are two different things. M is moving in, E is moving out. Migratory movements add to ethnic and cultural diversity in many societies and help shape demographic, economic, and social dynamics. On the flip side of that, they also, as we've seen a lot in the United States, can create tensions and can create ostracization or otherizing of entire groups of people in ways that are not viable and or accurate. Today's ethnic and racial divisions stem from European colonial expansion into the Americas, Africa, and Australia, as well as the slave trade between Africa and the Americas. Slave trade is a really so language matters, right? And so when we talk about slave trade, we're talking about the trade of bodies who were kidnapped, forcibly removed, and physically harmed in order to be sold off. I think sometimes when we talk about the slave trade or when we talk about this particular terminology, slavery or what have you, we talk about it as this non-tangible idea, or this just inherent thing that was part of the world, when really without colonialistic ideas, without this ethnocentric view of the world, without the great pillage plundering that came with European expansion, that's not possible. The slave trade is not possible. Slavery is not possible. Racism is not possible. And so really understanding how that's tied to colonialization and why it's so important that we name that, acknowledge that, and move through the world in a way that is trying to deconstruct those colonialistic expansion, inherent right to resources, opportunity, wealth, power, prestige. If we don't really consistently butt up against some of those ideas, then it's really hard to make change and to make right all of the harms that have been done to such a wide number of cultural communities and people throughout the course of history in the name of colonialism. The early period of colonialism coincided with the rise of scientific racism. Scientific racism was when they used really inaccurate scientific research and data to justify beliefs. So this was like the measuring of skulls to prove that African people were less human, or what have you, or less smart than white individuals. Meanwhile, again, there was so much variation between what the measurement of white skulls were, that the way in which they even operated the science wouldn't fly in a peer-reviewed journal at this point. There are a lot of scientific racisms that are still embedded in our understandings of how we understand science. So, for example, we use racial indicators to understand how disease operates, the likelihood that someone is going to be, like, say, diabetic, or the likelihood that someone is going to do this. And we look at these through a racial lens. But when we look at DNA strands, when we look at the very fabric of what makes a human operate at a cellular level, we can't pinpoint races. We can't, there's not a conceptualized way to do that that has been proven at this point. And so we're saying that fundamentally, at a biological, very root level, we can't separate races, but then saying that medically people are predispositioned for things based on their race is not accurate. Now, that's not to say that different racial categories don't experience the world in a different way and don't experience different resources, like access to healthcare, resources like access to healthy foods, resources like access to education about particular health concerns. All of those things can very much make particular racial categories more susceptible to certain preventable diseases or preventable disorders, based on the fact that they have been geographically isolated from, say, good food, or economically isolated from many preventative care measures, or and that's not to say that the discrimination within the healthcare service is part of the reason that they don't have access to some of the medical things and preventative care things that they need, or even the desire to go to hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of how scientific racism has real impact on how we do science, because there's so many things that are really, we're discussing at using these racial category boxes that also have issues because they involve a wide variety of people into one homogenized group. So saying that Asian Americans are more likely to have eye problems, and I'm just giving an example, I don't even know if that's accurate. Again, it's probably not, because the idea of one racial category of Asian individuals, that in and of itself is has so very much like differences based on population, based on culture, based on access, based on like region, based on all of these things. It's going to have so many different possibilities that when we even look to do those resources, what we're really looking at when it comes to most scientific research on differences in people is we're looking at the differences society deems them. We're looking at the differences in how they're treated. We're looking at the differences in what access they have to things. We're looking at the difference in opportunity. We're looking at the difference in all in how um, how the world is socially constructed and what that means for people in a lived experience. And because of that, we have created so much scientific racism that there's an inherent bias of race, of gender, of what have you, built into how we do science. And it's something that has to be regularly checked. So as you move through the world and as you start to do possibly your own research or work in a company or what have you, I dare you to question what things are assumed of people and how those assumptions play out into real world consequences. All right, so the most extreme and devastating forms of group relation involves genocide. Genocide is a systemic planned destruction of racial, ethnic, religious, political, or cultural group. And this is not just physical. This genocide can also be cultural genocide, language genocide. There is also genocide in the way of educational resources, genocide, economic genocide, where essentially genocide of the land in which an entire operates in, and so their entire systems have to change. Genocide can look a number of ways. Obviously, the most awful of those is genocides of actual humans and the actual bodies and physical representations of those particular categories in the way of people. So exploitation of minority groups is often made possible by segregation. Segregation is the practice of keeping racial or ethnic groups physically separate. It's pretty self-explanatory. Assimilation is the idea that the minority group needs to take on the values and norms of the dominant group. And that's usually based on ideas within the dominant structure that deem those as hierarchically more valued or better or what have you. The melting pot is this idea that ethnic differences can be combined to create new patterns of behaviors, drawing on diverse cultural sources. Problems with the melting pot is that doesn't give individuals the ability to be their own individual identities. It means that we're trying to make essentially a new dominant group that includes some part of everything, which doesn't always work. Pluralism is a newer model of ethnic relations, which allows there to be multiple different separate identities that share equally in the rights and powers of citizenship. Multiculturalism is the condition in which ethnic groups exist separately and share equally in economic, political life. Obviously, pluralism and or multiculturalism has not been adopted in most parts of the world. However, it is something that activists and people are really looking towards trying to seek out. The problem is that because there's this intersecting levels of discrimination, that you can't pull racism down without having to talk about sexism, without having to talk about homophobia, without having to talk about all these other things, right? Because they're all interlinked and create and shape the way an individual person has to walk through society or ride. Because see, even as a disabled person who doesn't get to walk all the time, I still use the term walk through society because it's something that's ingrained into me as part of language. And that in and of itself shows how much certain things are just ingrained into us, right? Not everybody can walk through society, both figuratively or literally. And so using that as a term is automatically not including a particular minority subset, and that subset includes myself, and I still say those things, right? So these are what I'm talking about the fact that prejudices, the biases, and the things that we learn get ingrained in ways that don't can even prove to help maintain that social dynamic that creates our own discrimination, right? That creates things that happen to us as human beings. So even though that particular language that may not be harming, it comes with the assumption that if you can't walk through society, you don't get to be included. And that walking is the normative. And because of that, if you can't do that, then you are by nature abnormal. And so questioning that is something, critiquing that in the moment as I'm doing that right now is a great example of the ways in which we need to think about how the world has shaped us and how we want to reshape it. All right. So institutional racism, we're going to get back into this. Sorry. Is the idea that racism occurs through effective and established institutions in society rather than hateful actions of some bad people. Now, that's not to say you can't have institutional racism and individualized racism at the same time. It's just saying that at the institutional level, those things are built in based on ideas, essentially, of the world whenever those laws were made, whenever those practices were made, whenever those policies were made, whenever, or by who they were made, that allow particular social institutions to have practices supporting those who wrote them, those who were they were considered to be for. And if they don't get questioned, if they don't get critically analyzed, then those things are going to stay mostly impacting the opportunities disproportionately of minority groups. So let's talk about George Floyd and institutional racism, because this is really where society has most recently been really analyzing institutionalized racism at a fundamental level. And so we talk about this as we talk about policing, as we talk about law enforcement, and we talk about law enforcement at this institutional level, right? So when George Floyd was murdered by police officers exercising an excessive amount of force, there was and this call has been happening since forever, for as long as there has been policing of humans, policing. Okay, first of all, the history of the police force was inherently to maintain property for those who could own it. At the time in which police forces and law enforcement started to happen, that was considered to be white males of particular economic social status. That allowed for laws to be written, policing to be part of the part of what kept slavery, part of what kept Jim Crow, part of what, it's an institution that was fundamentally founded on ideas of racial segregation, of racial hierarchies, of intent to property, of people as property, of this idea or concept that particularly men of color were inherently dangerous or inherently a threat to white women or white businesses, white economic security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because of this, those policies and the way in which policing has been, because I think people sometimes forget, it was only 60 years ago. Wait, math. Yeah. It's only 60 years ago that real forms of citizenship were being offered in the way of voting, in the way of really hammering down Jim Crow laws for Black individuals in this country. 60 years is not a lot of time. That's not a lot of generations. That's my grandparents' generation. That's people that are still alive, having witnessed that having lived through those things in a very tangible way. And even prior to that, slavery itself has not been gone for, historically speaking, a very long time at all. This was a very recent phenomenon, and it's still a phenomenon that happens in our global economy, in our global world. So understanding that we built a law enforcement practice on the idea of catching slaves, on the idea of ensuring white male property, on the idea of ensuring the security of particularly one dominant, like, colonialistic idea of power, and shaping the entire institution that way, that as they made policies, they're inherently going to do more policing of Black bodies. They're inherently going to make assumptions of what those things are. Also, have you ever watched, like, and this is a prime example of how we understand policing in the United States. When you look at our media sources, especially for primetime television, how many of them are based on policing? In those police shows, how much of the policing is done on, how much of it is dealing with white collar crime? How much of it is dealing with white male sexual violence? How much of it is dealing with, and then when you look at the demographics of the perpetrators on those shows, how many of them are white comparatively to how many of them are Black, are Muslim, are from any kind of the Middle East region, are Mexican, are more broadly any of the Central America or South America categories. Like, you're going to see predominantly media imagery of police forces dealing with people of color. And that is because we have inherently ingrained understandings of our police force as policing Black and brown bodies, specifically Black and brown male bodies. And so in doing that, those police forces are trained to look at certain neighborhoods in a certain way, and those neighborhoods are going to have predominantly Black and brown bodies in them. They're going to look at economic lower economic regions, which are going to predominantly be Black and brown bodied because of the way we divide economic resources in this country, and the way we've limited economic resources for certain groups for, again, an extended period of time. We're looking at 60 years out of Jim Crow. That's it, people. And so understanding how recently all of these historic measures have been instilled in the police, the law enforcement practices, it is no wonder that those law enforcement practices are still creating this excessive violence against these particular groups. Are overarchingly, all of the science is showing that there is a discrepancy in the use of force and the arrest percentages, what they are getting arrested for. You cannot tell me that on college campuses, are seeing less illegal marijuana use in white students, are seeing less in white students than they are in any other kind of students of any other demographic. Now they're going to get treated very differently for obtaining or having marijuana on them in any given situation. The likelihood that they'll even be searched in the first place as a white person is far less. All of these things end up being that this judicial system ends up favoring one group and disproportionately causing harm and violence to other groups. And what George Floyd's murder did was draw a very shining, big, huge beacon on this particular situation. And this situation created a pivotal point of, okay, if you still can't see what's right in front of you, I don't know how to explain further that this is about lives. This is about literally protecting our community, protecting the people we care about, protecting our loved ones, protecting our families. And there was a lot of polarization that happened with this, but at the core root of this was this underarching need for critical reflection of how racism, how particularly our racial hierarchies are embedded in historic documents, policies, procedures, institutions. And I think that as we move forward, we're going to have to keep critically reflecting on a lot of different things as it relates to how minority groups are treated and the assumptions that are made of them. All right. So moving on, racism again can be expressed overtly. And we saw a lot of that, a resurgence of that in this country through the political term of Donald Trump. And the statements that were made by and are continuing to be made by political and political leaders. So Benaya, I'm gonna say it's Vanilla Silva. I'm not saying his name right, but anyway, defines colorblind race, color blindness as a means of maintaining racial inequality without appearing racist. So essentially saying that you don't see color. Well, color exists, and while those, while we want to have a world that doesn't see color and doesn't see that difference in us, those differences are actually not inherently bad. Right? It's okay to acknowledge those differences. It's okay to, and it's especially important to acknowledge how those differences create different lived experiences. There's a significant aspect of colorblindness called white privilege. White privilege is just essentially unacknowledged and unearned assets of benefit. So it's essentially the opportunities and access that white people are afforded in society that are ingrained into it. They're not questioned. It's not a struggle to obtain. It's not something that you have to think about. And Peggy McIntosh does a really interesting thing where there was essentially a list of things that you could check off. Now, again, there's also other identities that played into writing that, and that's something that has been critiqued and expounded upon. But one of the ones I always found most interesting was, I can find band-aids that match my skin. It's something small, but it's something that you don't think about. And it's something that as a white person, I don't ever have to walk into a store and think about. But as a person of color, that's something that they're probably gonna have to pay extra for if they do find it. And if they don't find it, it's something that's going to be very tangible. It's going to be something that's very present if they are wearing those in a public place or in what have you. There's already an inherent assumption of what a body is supposed to be in those, based on the color of those band-aids and the color of the nude shade of pantyhose or what have you. And so that's something to think about when you're thinking about things like white privilege. It's not to say that you're automatically going to be wealthy or that you're automatically going to be treated fairly, because we have multiple intersections of identity, right? Class is going to intersect with our race, as is gender, as is sexuality, as is ability, as is immigration status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But we differentiate those particular privileges as white privileges based on the fact that they are something that I am not going to even remotely have access to if I am a person of color. if that makes sense. Racial microaggressions are these small, slight indignities or acts of disrespect that are harmful to people of color, and are perpetuated by usually well-meaning whites. Like something as the "you speak really good English," or for a person like you are X, Y, and Z. If you are clarifying any statement with an assumption of what someone should be, you are usually creating some kind of microaggression. All right. I'm going to stop here and I'll start another one here in a minute. I know this is a lot, but it's an incredibly important conversation to be having in this current atmosphere.